the federal government should nationalize medical supply acquisition. The federal government should take over that function of contracting and acquiring all of the medical supplies that we need. Now, that elected official could have been Senator Bernie Sanders or Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but it was actually New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. He called on nationalization of the masks, gowns, ventilators, and other goods needed to deal with the COVID-19 epidemic in the state because the free market free-for-all that has been the backbone of the Trump administration's response to the epidemic has failed and has put lives at risk. It is simply not serving the public good. The next day, when Cuomo was challenged to defend his statement, he said, yes, it's an assertion of government power on private sector companies. Yes, but so what? This is an emergency. Yes, this is an emergency. But what this emergency may actually be teaching us something about how we should reorder our economy so that our health, safety, and well-being is protected at all times, and so that we are better prepared for the next emergency. So what we've decided to do is bring together four of the best voices out there on this issue. Kate Aronoff is a staff writer at the New Republic and author, most recently, of the article, A Moderate Proposal, Nationalize the Fossil Fuel Industry. Robert Hockett is the Edward Cornell Professor of Law at Cornell University School of Law. He's also a visiting professor of finance at Georgetown University, Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business. And he's the author of an article, How to Mobilize the Military to Produce the Supplies America Needs to Fight Coronavirus. Alexander Salmon is a staff writer at the American Prospect. And his article is, It's Time to Nationalize the Airlines. Finally, we have Thomas Hanna, who's the Director of Research at the Democracy Collaborative. And he's written an article that appears on our website at the nextsystem.org, A History of Nationalization in the United States from 1917 to 2009. And I'd like to start with Thomas. And if you could briefly just talk about this history of nationalization in the United States. You've made the argument that it is not as foreign, is not as extreme as it is often characterized.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Isaiah. Welcome, everybody. So yeah, first and foremost, I think we need to point out that nationalization is fairly common in American history. The other day, Trump made a statement on nationalization that, unsurprisingly was full of errors. He said that we're a country not based on nationalizing our business, and then he went on to imply that nationalization will always be a failure. So on the first point, as Isaiah just mentioned, I wrote a report last year detailing the history of nationalization in the US during the 20th century. And by nationalization, I was speaking about when the federal government was taking ownership or control of private enterprises and assets. And we're talking about hundreds, if not thousands of companies, in some cases, entire industries. And I think one of the most interesting things about this history is that from case to case and crisis to crisis, nationalization looks quite different. Different rationales, different methods, different legal authority, different durations, different operational structures, different outcomes, and so on. And to me, I think that really underscores how nationalization is actually a really flexible policy tool. I think sometimes when we think about nationalization, we get this picture of a one-size-fits-all solution or a giant sledgehammer that hits the economy, but that's not really the case. Nationalization can be really specifically crafted to fit the needs of the specific crisis that the country is facing at any given time. And that's really what's happened throughout American history. And so I don't think I have time to go through the entire history of nationalization in the United States, but in the context of this ongoing mainstream discussion about using the Defense Production Act to, quote unquote, nationalize the medical supply chain to produce PPEs. I do want to mention, I think, one historical example. And during World War I, there were several cases when a private company that was making war materials for one reason or another wasn't able or willing to produce those materials. And then the government came in and nationalized those companies and set up a government-owned corporation to run those companies. And so the Defense Production Act doesn't actually nationalize private companies. It compels them to produce certain materials. And history actually tells us that there's a good chance that if you compel the private sector to produce something, they're actually going to either resist doing that or they'll be unable to do that. And at that point, I really think nationalization should be 100% on the table, just like it was during World War I or World War II. Secondly, that second point that Trump made about nationalization being a failure, the history of nationalization, the US experience definitely demonstrates that actually that's the opposite. In crisis situations, nationalization has been a very effective policy tool. It's kept production and services going in the face of private sector inefficiency, management labor conflicts, collapsing financial markets, and so on and so forth. I mean, even if you use conventional financial and efficiency metrics, US nationalizations have actually often fared fairly well. For instance, in the 70s, the US government nationalized failing freight railroad companies and created Conrail. Conrail then consolidated its operations, streamlined its management, made critical infrastructure investments, and so on. And it was so successful that in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan came in and privatized the company in what was then one of the largest IPOs in US history. Another example is during World War II, we nationalized the foreign subsidiaries of German and Japanese companies, and we ran them. In some cases for like 15 years, like up into the 1960s. And a lot of academics who studied these, I mentioned this in my book on public ownership a few years back, a lot of academics who studied these nationalizations generally agreed that these companies were really well run and as efficient, if not more efficient than some of their private sector counterparts. So I think I'll leave it off there for now and turn it back over. You're on mute, Isaiah.
Yeah, Isaiah, you're muted.
I am. The curse of these teleconferences is that you're unmuting. Robert Hockett, wanted to. So, what about you? Proposed this idea about using the military actually, and Thomas referenced that a little bit. Explain first of all what you mean by that, number one. And number two, my question would be, for a lot of us, having the military run anything is a pretty scary thing. And we've seen the inefficiencies and the wasted spending that happens in the military. So is there something, how do you separate the wheat from the chaff when it comes to that particular issue?
Right. So I don't actually want the military to sort of run everything. I want to use certain military resources that we currently have in what I guess you could think of as a sort of a phased approach to what is beginning to emerge as a kind of supply crisis, right? So one of the things that really distinguishes the current crisis from that of 2008 is that in addition to being a demand side and a financial crisis, it's also an emergent supply side crisis, and it's beginning to manifest. Of course, it's first manifesting itself with respect to certain essential medical supplies and medical services, most notably, of course, respiratory ventilators, masks, soon, it seems, hospital beds, hospital space, other kinds of essentials like that. Before long, it could very well afflict other essentials that aren't strictly civil. You probably read yesterday that Purdue Chicken has had COVID emerge on their production lines. There have been reports about Amazon warehouses having people coming down with COVID. There are basically various kind of critical sort of infrastructural portions, you might say, of our economy that are essential to everything else happening. And these are sectors where social distancing is just not possible. It's not compatible with continued functioning. So I thought that what we got to do is we need a sort of a phased mode of address of the emerging supply crisis to sort of complement the demand side measures that happily we're taking now that we didn't take quickly enough in 2008. And so what does that mean in turn? Well, it means a couple of things. First of all, the essential personnel, right? The people who are actually producing or distributing those masks or those ventilators or those hospital beds or whatever have to be able to wear protective gear right now in order to be doing that producing and that distributing. And all right, what do we furnish them with? What productive gear do we give to them? Well, there are thousands and thousands of C40 protective biohazard masks that have been stockpiled by the military ever since the Gulf War, because some people might recall having heard about or read that, there was a worry that Saddam Hussein had biological weapons in the Gulf War and not just chemical weapons. So there are masks that seem to be helpful for these purposes. There's protective clothing that the military has for these purposes. And so the idea of, at least in phase one of addressing our looming supply crisis, the idea of having the military distribute that kind of protective equipment immediately to all essential people, and that means starting with health providing people, and then productive people who are producing basic necessities like foodstuffs and the like, and then sort of fundamentally necessary distributive people like postal delivery people, for example, or the UPS drivers, or again, the people who are packing the boxes at the Amazon warehouses and the like. Basically distributing all of this material to them. That's sort of the first part. Second part, phase two, I'm thinking we might end up having to repurpose existing productive facilities, existing factories and the like, and maybe even expanding them in the same way that we did in the Second World War, when under the guidance of the War Production Board. And insofar as it's necessary to do that, well, we actually have the world's largest engineering entity or engineering organization right here in the States too. It's called the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and it has 37,000 personnel. Some of them are military personnel on a permanent basis, but others are contractors or sort of private sector folk who the Corps of Engineers regularly contracts with. But the idea here is essentially immediately to mobilize the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So I'm not talking about people walking around with guns or helmets or the like, but the actual constructive rather than the destructive bombing type folk to start basically repurposing as necessary and expanding as necessary, and even building and constructing de novo, if necessary, the facilities necessary to produce adequate quantities of these medical essentials and then other non-medical essentials that might end up turning out to be in short supply if we don't peak right away when it comes to sort of a total number of COVID cases. So that's the idea in a nutshell. Oh, sorry, you're muted again, Isaac.
Yeah, I want to get back to that. But in the meantime, I want to talk to Kate Aronoff. And you wrote a very provocative article that got a lot of traction on Twitter about the oil industry. And your argument is that now is the time to actually do a federal takeover of the oil industry. Why would we even think of doing that? And why would we think of doing that now of all times?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I just want to start off by saying a lot of what I know about this comes from the Democracy Collaborative and from the Next System project. So I am very indebted to Thomas and to Carla and Johanna. So please go and read everything that they've written about this, including Thomas's great report on nationalization, which I interviewed him about for this piece. So why should we nationalize the oil companies right now? I think it deserves looking just at what is happening in oil and gas right now, and particularly in shale drilling, which is most of what we do in the United States. So hydraulic fracturing, this technology which has been around for a long time, but that really picked up right after the last financial crisis. And so what you saw happen about a decade ago was that this technology, which again had existed, but had not been profitable, it's very capital intensive, takes a lot of resources and investment up front, started to take off. So why did it take off? There's a lot of money sort of going around the economy because we had done several rounds of quantitative easing, and interest rates were very low. So all of a sudden there was new capital available to put into this thing, which to that point investors just had not been interested in. And so in the last decade, basically none of these companies have made a profit in shale drilling. So many of these companies have been cash flow negative since they've been around. And starting in the last couple of years, they started to get cut off from their access to Wall Street banks, to Wall Street financing, because they just saw that they had never really made money. These companies had been sort of unsuccessful on their own terms for sort of reasons about the U.S. Fossil fuel industry, which we can get into. But now, what had been shaping up to be a crisis in its own right is now sort of an apocalyptic scenario for many of these companies. That's due to a couple things. So one, the demand shock of the coronavirus causing shutdowns, really decreasing demand for fossil fuels all over the world. Another is a price war between Russia and OPEC. And so some of these things have to do with, factors beyond the control of the sector. And another thing that's sort of informing all this is that these companies just keep drilling. That's all they've done for the last decade. And the problem right now for them on their own terms is that there's too much supply. There's just too much oil in the market. And yet what they keep doing, because this is how these companies were valued for a long time, is to just keep drilling to the point that it's really against their own sort of rational economic self-interest. And yet, they just keep going. And so many of these companies are facing bankruptcies. We saw a spike in bankruptcies last year before any of this happened. 42 companies went under. Just last year in Appalachia and the Marcellus Shale, companies spent $73.4 billion more than they made. And so there were already sort of lingering problems, and this most recent crisis has really just cratered, I think, the business model of a lot of these companies. And so tens of thousands of people are being laid off. That number, I think, as we'll see in the weeks and months to come, could skyrocket. And so I think we talk a lot about, a just transition is something which is sort of far off in the future, but for many workers right now, that is a pressing concern. People, are facing a sort of loss of their livelihoods. And as we know from the bankruptcies of coal companies in the last couple of years, the CEOs of those companies are not going to be so willing to sort of make these workers whole. And we could see, not just sort of individual workers and companies devastated their employees, but whole communities and even tax bases, which depend in large part on the sort of revenues from workers who, have been making fairly high wages for a long time. And so some of these companies have gone asking for help from the Trump administration, which initially they seemed sort of happy to provide. It's a little unclear whether that will happen, and asking really for a bailout. And so what that would entail is just giving money again, as we saw in the last financial crisis, to the heads of these companies who have no real fealty to the workers. And so nationalization, which I think in this case is a fairly modest proposal, it would involve, taking ideally a sort of 51% share of these companies and winding them down in a way that is respectful to the folks who work there, kind of makes people whole, and also kind of meets the climate goals that we know we need to meet. So you have a sector that's failing its own right, that we know, it needs to be sort of wound down on a reasonable timeline. And so we can do that in a way which screws people over and which allows CEOs to take their golden parachutes out, as they have in the coal industry, or we can do it in a way that really protects communities and creates the pathway to a low carbon future and widespread prosperity. And the last thing I'll say is that, as Thomas mentioned, I think we talk about nationalization as a sort of unprecedented thing. When it comes to the fossil fuel industry in particular, there's so much state support that already props up this industry. Conservative estimates put it at $26 billion, right? And so I would urge us to think about nationalizing the fossil fuel industry less as sort of a new intervention in the economy than retooling things we already do, right? So what else could we do with those $26 billion in state and federal money? We can, put that into building the economy we need, and really, protecting folks who need protection. Right now, I think we'll see, probably one of the deepest recessions in the country happen in the shale sector. And the government simply has no plan to protect people in that. So I think this is a way that we can, both meet our climate goals and really protect whole communities who otherwise are going to get screwed over, as they have been for generations, by CEOs who really just want a quick buck and could give less of a care about the communities who their drilling rigs are in.
And the interesting thing about that, we are, the Congress is right now is considering a $2 trillion economic stimulus package, whatever you want to call it. If the government wanted to take majority stakes in all of the oil companies and begin this sort of controlled wind down that you talked about, how much would it cost?
Yeah, so these companies are pretty cheap right now because oil prices are so low and their stock values have gone down. Not all of them are publicly traded. And so, I may not be the person to ask, to get too far into the weeds about that, but just sort of off some numbers I pulled the other day, Occidental Petroleum, which has been a major sort of force in the fracking sector, their market capitalization right now is $9.6 billion, which is a lot of money for any of us, of course. But if you're the federal government, that is relative chunk change, especially in the context of a $2 trillion stimulus. Even sort of bigger players like Shell is $100 billion right now. Exxon is about $140 billion. BP is around $60 billion. So these are not huge numbers, actually, right? And those are the total market capitalizations. You're talking about 51% of that. It's half, roughly. And so this is not something that is too expensive. I think, it would be a big fight any way you think about it. But I think it's, well within the sort of realm of financial possibility for the United States.
We can come back to this later, but this is going to be true of the financial sector too. So if we have time, Isaiah, we might come back to the financial services industry at some point here, because it's going to be, basically the government is going to prop it up and basically enable it to continue existing just like petroleum. And it seems to me that what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander here, that means the public has a right, but we can come back to it because I know that.
We also, in that context, ought to talk about public banking. We don't have an advocate for public banking on this particular panel, but
you actually do. You actually do. I'm a board member of the Public Banking Institute. So
well, welcome aboard. We'll invite you to put that hat on in just a second.
Yeah, we'll come to that later, I'm sure.
Okay, I want to turn to Alexander Salmon, who is a writer at the American Prospect, and there is a lot of anger around a proposal to give about $50 billion to the airline industry. And anybody who has been on a plane lately would be justifiably be wondering, why do we want to give these folks money after they've taken all my baggage fees and everything else? Why do they need an extra 50 billion? You actually sort of deconstruct that anger a bit and really talk about a way that we should be approaching any sort of revitalization of the airline industry. So can you give us a real quick recap of what you argued there?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks so much for having me here. I'm excited to be on this panel with all you guys. Yeah, so the airline industry is interesting because the last 10 years have been basically marked record-breaking profits for them. They've been as profitable as they ever have been. Year after year, they've set the pace on profits, and the vast majority of that has come in the form of baggage fees. It's come in the form of getting rid of meals, getting rid of seatback entertainment, charging for all that stuff, surging change fees. So basically, the innovation that's taken place in the sector in 10 years is basically to charge for stuff that used to be free. And they've taken that money, that literally, billions of dollars of profit that they've conjured out of thin air, and they have funneled it all into stock buybacks. So the largest airlines in the United States over the last 10 years spent 96% of free cash flow on stock buybacks. And just to give a sense of how much money that is, it's roughly $45 billion over that period. And now they're asking the federal government for a $50 billion bailout, which is a pretty tidy summation of where we're at. So this is an industry that consumers rightfully hate. I mean, it's an extremely immiserating experience to fly in the United States these days. You have to pay if you want to take your legs with you. You have to pay if you want to take a bag on board. You have to pay if you want the pretzels. And so there's an abundance of reasons why this management scheme isn't working. It's not working on a consumer level. It's not working on a business level, because now we find out that these companies, despite having billions of dollars in profits, are actually only 6 to 8 weeks away from going out of business entirely. And it's not working on an environmental level. I mean, obviously, this is something that I think will probably come up again, is that a lot of these industries, and the airline industry in particular, has a horrific environmental track record, and we've been basically unable to rein it in any meaningful way. So you have in a very profound sense, you have basically a management structure here, a management scheme that has failed. You have corporate executives who've basically pillaged their own company. They've plundered the financial resources of their own companies to funnel money back to the stockholders, who in turn sign off on increased executive compensation for them. So one hand washes the other, and the company has suffered and fallen by the wayside. So the case that I'm trying to make in this piece is that we know, in fact, what to do in a situation like this. It's very clear that that this management regime isn't working. It's a failed operation. And as the airlines would say, that they provide an essential public service. Let's take them at their word when they say that. We do need an airline industry. Unfortunately, we can't trust them to provide it. And so what we can do is there's a number of options. Obviously, there are airlines all over the world that are publicly owned. Just 10 days ago, the Italian government nationalized Alitalia, which is the Italian airline. The most popular 20 of the largest airlines internationally are publicly owned in some way or another, and they are much more pleasant to fly on. I tell you that with absolute certainty. But even in the United States, we have a track record of public ownership of the airlines. And so for the first 40 years this industry existed, it was treated as a public utility, and it was managed by a government board, the Civil Aeronautics Board, the CAB, which managed flights. It set prices, it established fares and schedules and routes. And it was, and that's how air travel existed in this country for 40 years. Well, the next 40 years, we get this wildly deregulated and hyper privatized sector, where all of a sudden you go from hundreds of airlines to 4. The costs did go down in the beginning of the deregulation era, but they went down actually slower than they were going down the previous decade. So you have this kind of categorical failure, even on its own terms, within this industry. And given that they now have come calling at the public purse and are in such dire financial straits, it seems like a very wise time to say, well, what do we know actually works? Like, how can we trust that this essential industry will be there for people when they need it? And the answer is, well, we already know. The tools are available to us, and they've been available in the United States for decades. They've been available everywhere else in the world. And so I think that the course of action here is obviously to say that privatization is not a one-way street. It's not, this deregulation regime doesn't only head in one direction. And we can say, look, this was a mistake. Clearly, I mean, just it's a debacle, and we can go back and act in a different way. And so I think the reason that the airline industry is interesting, it's also true of fossil fuel industry, but we like to think of this period of deregulation, the neoliberal era, in some ways being marked as the 40 years starting from 1980 to current day. The airline industry was deregulated in 1978. So in a lot of ways, it's a bellwether for a lot of other industries, and kind of set the tone for this era that we are now firmly ensconced in, and are now get to pick up the pieces at incredible public expense. So I won't go on any further, but that's kind of the argument in total.
Let me add that we actually have an example of a nationwide nationalized public transportation or network, which is Amtrak. And right. That for many people works very well, and with more investment would work even better. Mm-hmm. So one of the arguments that I might make as a transportation nerd is that in the process of nationalizing the airlines, we actually invest more in Amtrak, create a high-speed rail network, which would be more carbon efficient than flying airplanes, and then use airplanes in their proper role for long-haul travel, and medium distance travel should be done on rail. Mm-hmm. Just a thought.
Yeah. And Kansas City, by the way, just became the first sort of sizable city in the country to entirely basically render free of charge public transportation, right? So bus travel all over Kansas City is now free of charge. So you can imagine local initiatives like this taking place too, particularly if the feds were willing to help subsidize it.
We're actually having an experiment here in DC because there have been some conversations about free public transportation here in DC. And right now buses are free because they don't want passenger contact with the drivers.
Yeah.
See how that goes. I want to we're beginning to get some questions. And one of the questions, by the way, if you all want to use the Q&A function or the chat function to pose questions, feel free. But one question that immediately comes to mind that was raised in the chat is this idea of, all of this would sound very good in an administration that we would like. But what happens when there's an administration that we don't like? Tell me about the politics of this. Does it depend on who's in the White House, for example?
I'll just throw in something really quickly. I think it can, right? I don't think anybody has all the trust in the world for the current administration, and I don't think anybody is, believes that there wouldn't be any advantage taken of new powers, for example, that might be conferred on the present administration. That being said, you could imagine ways to kind of maybe appeal to certain impulses that this character seems to have or be subject to in getting him to do something. I thought, for example, what if we promise that every new thing that we build will have his name on it, instead of Hoover Dam, we could have, the Trump light rail network or the Trump this or that. We could always then, take those names off later in the manner of Confederate monuments. But for the time being, if it takes a bit of flattery and a bit of appeal to the guy's vanity to get him to sort of do the right thing, I suppose, maybe we could do that. But that would still not address the problem of basic competence. I think that, more than, even worse in some ways than his being basically a walking id, is the fact that I just don't think he's really compos mentis, or I don't think the kind of administration that he's put around him is compos mentis. It's not a coherently acting collective agent. And we have to figure out, I think, some way of putting in place a kind of a collective agent that's able to act on behalf of the nation as a whole in the absence of a presidential administration that obviously doesn't have that capacity. That's
well. Let me throw this to Thomas, because Thomas, you and I have had these conversations before about the image that government has, the bad rap that government has gotten, partly because there's been a right-wing info war against government, but there have been some legitimate criticisms of top-down bureaucracies. And what you've argued is that we don't have to go back to old school top-down bureaucracies when we talk about public ownership or nationalization.
Yeah, I think I mentioned earlier that in my view, nationalization or public ownership more generally is a flexible tool. It's not a one-size-fits-all tool. Unlike private enterprise, it's not necessarily constrained by or sort of beholden to market imperatives like growth and profit and competition. It can be really consciously designed to meet the needs and the requirements of the time and the place. So there's no requirement that a nationalized or publicly owned enterprise has to take the form of the traditional, top-down, state-owned company that many of us think about when we think about public ownership. One of my favorite quotes is by a guy named Ken Coates, who's a British socialist, and he was a founder of the Institute for Worker Control. And he said, there's no reason why the sort of crudely centralized state ownership model must be the predominant form of common ownership in the sort of new economy or the future economy. And so I don't want to go on too much, but there's a lot of increasing interest around this concept of sort of democratic public ownership. So in other words, different approaches to public ownership that might be more decentralized, might be more participatory, more equitable, more sustainable, and so on and so forth. And I've written a lot about that, so I sort of urge people to check out some of that material. But I guess the one other thing I would sort of point out is that, we've had sort of unsavory characters in the past nationalized companies. Amtrak was essentially nationalized during the Nixon administration, and he was a pretty unsavory character. And I think that whoever is in charge, I do appreciate and completely understand the wariness of sort of nationalizing enterprise during an administration that we're not too fond of. But we do still have a political system that is a little bit more decentralized. There's other actors at play. So I think that a lot of it's about pressure and about demand and about constructing and being clear and articulate about what we want to see in the nationalization or what we want to see in public ownership, and sort of bringing the pressure to bear on that if any of this stuff was ever to actually start to be discussed or debated. I know that in this conversation around the Defense Production Act and around trying to get more PPEs, there's a very live conversation amongst the movement that's being developed around putting sort of patient advocates and putting professional medical personnel sort of in the management and in the decision-making process around how that would work. And so getting the frontline workers, the frontline communities, their voice, because they know better than anyone else how these things should and could run, getting their voice in there. And that's a live conversation that people who are in power, some of the politicians who are advancing some of these questions around PPEs are discussing, and they're taking it very seriously.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Kate.
Yeah, just to respond to that question, because I think this is an interesting question with regard to the fossil fuel industry in particular, because there are actually quite a lot of fossil fuel companies that are under public ownership worldwide. I'm sure people are familiar with Saudi Aramco, Citgo, many fossil fuel assets are under public ownership, and those are not necessarily progressive institutions, right? Those are not the sort of publicly owned bodies that we would want to see. And so I think two things about that. I think the fight by which this happens is important, right? So you could feasibly imagine a Trump administration nationalizing even the fossil fuel industry, as outlandish as that might sound, just to make its production more rational, right? We've had historic levels of government involvement in the fossil fuel industry, not just subsidies, but actually, bodies like the Texas Railroad Commission have intervened to stop production, right? To control levels of drilling in the past. And so you could see sort of that happening again, trying to make the business model work on its own terms. But I think the difference between that and a nationalization, which happens as part of a Green New Deal, for instance, is very wide, right? And so I think it's one thing to say we're going to bring this company under public ownership, and that's it, right? That is the only thing that's happening. I think it's another thing to do that alongside a suite of investments in renewable technology, allowing the economies of communities who have historically relied on revenues and the sort of economic stimulus of the fossil fuel industry to diversify, to build out their own economies in ways that do not depend on coal or oil or gas. You have to have really complementary policies in order to make something like this really viable. And I think it should, the conversation about this should well include the types of things Thomas is working about, is writing about. There's some folks in the UK who have done some great work on putting, putting folks on the boards of companies, giving people an ownership stake and kind of what in the future of these companies. And so I think there's, as Thomas said, this is a flexible tool, and I think it can look a lot of different ways. And I think policy design is really important in that context, and sort of how you sequence these things can really make a big difference, and set this up for success, or for something less than that.
Thank you. I have a question from someone who wants to delve into the politics of this and how the political, I think both the political process and the politics. I want to go to Alexander and the airlines. And how do you think the politics of this could play out if people really got serious?
Yeah, sure. To me, it's interesting because whenever this conversation takes place, there's a lot of concern about, well, how are the shareholders going to be treated in the situation? How is this going to play with shareholders? How is this going to play with people who have a vested economic interest in this not happening? And it's obviously the politics of that seem very thorny and treacherous to people, and seems like kind of a non-starter sometimes. What I would say to that from the outset is that these companies, if left to their own devices, by their own estimation, are going out of business. I mean, that's the option. If we do nothing here, they're not going to exist. So the kind of this generosity that people bring to this conversation always surprises me, because if we stood idly by, these companies are going to zero. And so I think that the question of the politics of it is very interesting. And obviously we've all been conditioned to think a certain way about these things. But in terms of, think about, just shareholders of American Airlines, say, and I'm sure, American Airlines is probably more or less a blue chip stock. I'm sure there are a lot of pension funds that own American Airlines. I'm sure there are a lot of retirees who hold American Airlines. And, no one wants to hose those people. But the truth of the matter is that those shareholders, they actively bought into this system. They bought into this management scheme that is obviously self-sabotaging, obviously suicidal, and they could have sold out of it at any time. And they chose not to because it was personally enriching. So I think that, there's a way in which we can kind of reimagine even the parameters of this, to say that, that there are political concerns, there are people who are going to object to this. But, in the case of the airlines, I think there's a very compelling pro-consumer case to be made here. I mean, the number of people who fly on airlines is going to outweigh the number of people who hold stock in American Airlines. And so, there's even in this kind of language of the market, you can make a compelling case that this is a pro-consumer thing, this is a pro-environmental thing, this is an economic necessity. And unfortunately, what's the alternative? Well, we've all been conditioned to say, well, the alternative is to just give them a blank check and continue on as they were. But I'm not sure that to me, that seems crazy. And so, I think it's what you're wise to point out, that there are some political concerns here, and obviously, Wall Street has an outsized say in the kind of the discourse here and the way these things get hashed out. And I certainly wouldn't want to minimize those things. But I think if we really think about the spate of options here, we would see that the politics of doing this are actually, I think, probably a little less alarming than they might seem on their face. If we're, I guess the message like, okay, we're taking this over, nationalization by force, seems a little more terrifying to people than to like really kind of look at what are the array of options here? What are the possible futures for this industry, and what kind of what do we want these essential public services to look like if they're going to continue to exist? So I think that's a component. I'm sure that doesn't get to the whole, that's just one bite at that apple, and I'm sure there are other people who can probably weigh in here as well. But I think that's something that I would kind of throw out there as a component of this.
What we've sort of seen historically with nationalizations is that often there's a concern that the industries and their owners will rebel and they'll oppose it and they'll fight it out in the courts and so on and so forth. And in some cases that is true. The Truman Steel Mill attempted nationalization is one in which industry very much opposed it and took the government all the way to the Supreme Court, and the government lost. However, in many other times in US history, the nationalization has been structured in a way that the companies actually like it and they want it and they willingly sell out to the government or transfer control. And often that's when compensation or other sort of financial benefits for the company's owners are generous. And so there's a question that we would have to consider here. There's an expediency versus cost question. Sometimes if you want to take these industries over quickly, oil and gas, for instance, with the climate crisis, if you want to take them quickly, maybe you have to be a little bit more generous. And I know it's a bitter pill to swallow. You don't want to make the fossil fuel investors whole. I know that's not something that's very popular, but maybe the time horizons mandate that, and maybe you have to do that. And for pension funds specifically, There's no reason why we can't design a nationalization so that pension fund investors can roll their investments over into something else, maybe a tax-free vehicle by which they can then invest in renewable energy stocks or portfolios or so on and so forth. There's a sort of a wide open range of possibilities of how you could structure that. I think lastly, really quickly, one person brought up something in the chat that was quite important. It's this question of what's existing federal authority or executive authority that could be utilized versus whether or not you need an act of Congress. And that is actually the point that's at the crux of the Truman Steel Mill takeover case. And the Supreme Court ruled that the executive did not have unlimited authority to start nationalizing or seizing private property. They had to work with Congress and so on. And most nationalizations in American history have had congressional authorization under like war powers authorization or some specific authorization from Congress that allows you to nationalize. And then once that exists, executive actions can happen within that context. So I think there is a live question about the Federal Reserve's authority under its mandate, and there's been some additional restrictions under Dodd-Frank that instead of directly targeting specific companies, you may have to target entire industries. Somebody else may be able to talk about that. But generally speaking, I think for nationalizations to go, you need to have some sort of underlying congressional legislation.
There are two other options here that are worth putting on the table, I think, just because if the politics were, say, too difficult when it comes to outright commandeering or taking of things that already exist, two other options are the following. One is the creation of new firms de novo, right? So seven of the most important government-owned corporations during the Second World War were simply created de novo, right? There was the National Rubber Corporation, the National Steel Corporation, the National this and that corporation. And they were created partly in order to provide a market to start stockpiling the sorts of materials that President Roosevelt needed those industries to start producing in much larger quantities in order to mobilize for the war effort. So you can always, the kind of contemporary counterpart to that, I suppose, would be public options of various kinds, right? And then secondly, you can imagine sort of partial nationalizations or temporary nationalizations. So, there were, of course, some nationalizations during the Second World War when certain corporations wouldn't play ball when it came to meeting or trying to meet steel quotas or rubber quotas or other sorts of things that necessitated temporary takeovers. That's, of course, sort of what happened with Truman as well in the Youngstown Steel case, right? That they weren't playing ball and there was labor unrest and they were unwilling, apparently, to compromise and the like. And I don't think that Youngstown was meant to be a permanent takeover. It was meant to be a temporary one. And it seems to me that in cases where we worry that the politics would somehow foreclose permanent takeovers, we could do more partial ones. The Fed is another interesting case in point. The Fed is a wonderful example of a partial takeover itself, right? So I think most people who know a bit about monetary history probably don't know about this, but essentially when we decided finally to have a central bank and to sort of empower and create a central bank in 1913, what we did was we took a network of essentially basically liquidity risk pooling banks. There was a sort of a network arrangement pursuant to which a number of Northeastern banks pooled liquidity risks together. It was called the New York Clearinghouse System. There were a number of other clearinghouse systems as well. And we simply took over that clearinghouse system and nationalized it. We called it the Federal Reserve System. But the reserve system basically just is, again, a liquidity risk pooling system. And it used to be a bit more sort of public-private when it was first founded with a public overseeing board. That's what the Federal Reserve Board is. And then as just a sort of a natural, I think, consequence of changes in the financial markets over the years, the public role in the Federal Reserve System became larger and larger and larger. So now it's very clearly more public than private. But in its inception, it started as a kind of mixed public-private arrangement where the public sector commandeered some previously private sector functions while leaving other private sector functions surprisingly high. And then it gives you sense in letting the public sector take on a gradually growing role if it turns out that the alternative is just outright calamity, like a complete financial collapse. So I think we should think about that kind of sort of evolutionary model and these kind of halfway house models as maybe stepping stones on the way to full nationalizations where necessary, or as alternatives to full nationalization when full nationalization is not necessary.
Yeah.
Kate, Go ahead, Kate.
I was just going to add briefly. I mean, the difference between a bailout, which we do a lot, and a nationalization is not that great, right? So the government took a 60% stake in GM after the last crisis, and Obama, I just looked this quote up, said the federal government will refrain from exercising its rights as a shareholder in all but the most fundamental business decisions, right? And so you can imagine a world in which the president does not say that, right? In which those rights are exercised, impose, some sort of basic controls in a way that any shareholder with majority stake would. It's not all that strange to imagine that going a different way, and the set of tools is actually, not so different. It's just a matter of what you do with them.
In fact, Kate, I was going to bring this up. A lot of people are interested in using the tool of public ownership or nationalization to push the goals of a Green New Deal. We talked about decarbonizing the economy. There is a further step which involves true environmental justice, a just transition. Go ahead and talk about that very briefly. We have about 7 minutes left, by the way.
Okay. I think this is really core to why nationalization is important. I mean, like I mentioned in the beginning, the CEOs of these companies really have no loyalty to the workers there, to the communities they've operated in for generations. Even, as we've seen in the coal industry in places like Appalachia, which whole community structured sort of root to branch around coal mining. And the CEOs are very happy to just leave when there's no longer a profit in it, and retire to their summer homes in Florida, and leave sort of wreckage in their wake, short workers on their pensions, leaving folks with black lung, all of that. And so I think there's no reason to believe that wouldn't be the case in the oil and gas sector, right? And we know that. Particularly when you're talking about places like the Permian Basin, for instance, folks are accustomed. Oil and gas has always been a boom and bust industry. What we're seeing now is a bust that is potentially permanent when we're talking about shale drilling, and particularly if we are thinking seriously about the climate limitations of continuing to mine up these fuels, which we know are cooking the planet. And so there are a couple different ways this can go. We can either crash out, we can leave people on their own effectively without a safety net, as we have seen in the last couple of days. The U.S. doesn't have a meaningful one, or we can create supports for people to to live dignified lives, have pensions, have wage parity for 5 years. There is federal policy that can do that, and I think it's also important not to think too narrowly about who the workers involved in a just transition are, and who the people in communities involved in a just transition are. I think we have to think kind of along the whole supply chain. So I mentioned the sort of tax bases. That's teachers, right? It's not just fossil fuel workers. And in the teacher strikes in 2018, the so-called red wave, people were calling for a natural gas severance tax, which had never been enacted in West Virginia, to fund the schools, right? You saw fracking executives get rich while the budgets for school districts collapsed, right? And so I think that is a just plainly unequal state of affairs. And I think full well we should be thinking about teachers and also folks who have been forced to live with fossil fuel infrastructure in their backyard. Why not have a just transition include clean water? Have it include the right to clean up these sites, clean up refineries, sort of make sure folks aren't living with pollution in their backyard anymore, right? And there's many people implicated in our fossil fuel economy, and I think a just transition has to sort of encapsulate all of that.
Right. So we only have about 3 minutes left.
Final point. Okay. Yeah, just one quick thing. I mean, it's worth noting, I think, in connection both with the Green New Deal and with any mobilization, including the COVID mobilization, is that because many sectors of the economy are implicated, you need at the very least some sort of coordinating authority to make sure that all of the different sectors are acting in a way that's kind of coherent, right? Mutually coherent. That's what the War Production Board during the Second World War did. It's what the War Industries Board during the First World War did. Both of those had financial partners. There was, of course, the the War Finance Corporation and then the Reconstruction Finance Corporation during the Second World War. I think we're going to need some sort of counterpart structure. I don't think that, to handle that mobilization that is the COVID response, I don't think a White House task force is going to be enough.
Well, let me ask each of you in the couple minutes that we have left to just take 30 seconds to address a question that's been dropped into the Q&A section. And that is, how do we build on this moment? How do we build something viable right now that can actually happen? Can I start with Alexander, and then let's go to Kate and Robert, and then close with Thomas.
Yeah, sure. So because the composition of this bailout is pretty much, more or less determined at this point for the airline industry, the opportunity has narrowed considerably, unfortunately. And in terms of what can we get out of, what can we get to move the ball on a $60 billion bailout or $50 billion bailout, depending on what's in there. I read earlier in a Bloomberg piece that there is a possibility that if Steve Mnuchin so decides, he could seek equity from the airlines in exchange for some of those loans and grants that they're expected to receive. So I don't know how you go about putting pressure on Steve Mnuchin to do that, but that would be kind of one minor and accessible way in which we could see progress be made on this front. I mean,
there are people who know how to mobilize build something, a public pressure campaign that would affect Mnuchin in that case.
Yeah. And so I think that's, that there is an avenue. The other avenue I think would be through organized labor. And part of the reason that the airline bailout, as I understand to this point, I haven't read the entirety of it, isn't as horrific as it could be, is because organized labor did play a role in setting the terms there. And so I think that, again, if you're, if you are part of organized labor or you have access there, the hope is that they will either get a seat on the board or have influence on the kind of the corporate composition of these companies going forward. That doesn't seem that improbable either, but it's very important. Having strong labor is basically essential to enacting some of these things at this point. And also, public pressure campaigns also work, but I think those are our two best options at this point with the airlines.
Kate, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer would be somewhat similar, which is that we need strong movements to demand that this happen, and particularly the involvement of labor unions who are close to the action, right? The involvement of the AFA and folks like Sarah Nelson and pushing, for this to be different. I think, they've made their voice very clear. I think it's a very complicated question when it comes to the unions that are involved in the fossil fuel sector, which have historically been a bit more conservative. But I think it's hard to imagine anything like this moving forward without some sort of buy-in, right? And I think that has to be, in part a conversation that happens within organized labor, and in part, to have this climate movement that we've seen explode in the last several years start articulating real policy that really lays out a very tangible path by which this could happen, because workers know that a just transition has never really happened in the United States. We have not really done that well, and so I think the more tangible that can look, and the more sure we can put meat on the bones of this policy, the more that will have legs and hopefully kind of work its way up the chain from movements and folks advocating for this to sympathetic members of Congress to hopefully federal policy eventually.
Right. Robert, you've got a few seconds.
Yeah, I'll keep it 30 seconds. Just if you would, if everybody listening or watching would just Google two things. First, Reconstruction Finance Corporation, also known as RFC, and then second, now my colleague Salih Morova and I have been pushing, it would be a latter day RFC.
Because I'm not quite sure that everybody heard that. They heard Reconstruction Finance Corporation. What was the second thing?
The second is National Investment Authority, or NIA.
Okay.
If you Google that, and then Google RFC as well, I think that's the essential structure that we need, essentially to structure a coherent national response to any mobilization need, including the Green New Deal especially, but also the COVID response more imminently now.
Thank you. Thomas, where do we go from here?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think this will be the last bailout of this crisis, to be perfectly honest. So although the ship may have sailed a little bit on some things, I think that we still have time to organize. I believe that the buyouts, not bailouts frame is a really good one to start organizing around. I think that it gives us time and opportunity. If we can get some of that in, and if we can do some buyouts and get some equity, it buys us a little bit of time to start thinking about what long-term public ownership might look like, what potentially breaking up some of these large concentrations of capital looks like, you know, say the finance sector, breaking them up into like local public banks or regional public banks or something like that. But I think first and foremost, we have to get control, and we have to use the opportunity to get control. And I like the buyouts, not bailouts frame.
Well, I want to thank all of our guests this afternoon. I want to thank our audience for tuning in. This has been a very vital conversation. Go to thenextsystem.org, bookmark that website, because you will find resources from all of these authors there, and opportunities to continue the conversation in your communities. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you all.
Thanks so much. Take care.